Die Energiewende ist sicherlich eine der Mammutaufgaben des
The energy
21.
transition
Jahrhunderts.
is definitely
In den
one of the
verschiedensten
biggest challenges
Sektoren
in the
schwankt sie einmal
21st
zwischen dem
century.
Wunsch nach
In the various
Stabilität
sectors,
und auch
there
zwischen der
we have to strike a
Notwendigkeit
balance between
nach
the wish for
Veränderung.
stability and the need for
Im
change.
Stromsektor, wenn man den
In
als
the
Beispiel mal
electricity
rausnimmt, kann man
area,
aber
if
gerade
you
eine ganz
choose
gute
this as an
Zwischenbilanz
example,
ziehen,
we
denn
can see,
der
can
Anteil an
take stock
erneuerbaren
and say
Energien im
that the
System
share
steigt
of renewable
relativ konstant über
energies
die letzte
in the
Zeit.
electricity
Zum
generation has
Beispiel
been
für den letzten
rising
Monat lag
quite
der Anteil an
consistently.
erneuerbaren
Last
Energien in
month, for
Deutschland
example,
bei etwa
the share of
56%.
renewable energies in Germany
Die
was at
Dekarbonisierung des ganzen
56%.
Systems geht
The
also voran.
decarbonization
Manche
of
Leute
the
sagen, sie
entire
ist zu
system
langsam,
thus
aber sie
is
geht voran
progressing. Some people
und
say it's not fast
es wird
enough,
ja auch
but it
immer noch
is
weiter
progressing,
ausgebaut bzw.
and
erneuert.
we still have some more expansion
Da sind wir
and
allerdings jetzt auch schon an
new
einer der Grenzen
activities.
der
But this
Energiewende.
already brings
Denn
us to one
mit
of
immer
the
höherer
restrictions of the
Einspeisung
energy
an immer mehr
transition.
dezentralen Stellen
Because if more and
kommt
more
auch das Netz und
electricity
kommen die
is
Netzbetriebe
provided
irgendwann an ihre
decentrally,
Grenzen.
grid
Und
operators will
ja, es
face a
gibt mehr
problem at some
erneuerbarer
point in
Strom,
time. Yes,
aber
there
wo soll der
is
denn
more
eigentlich
green
hinfinden?
electricity,
Ja,
but where do
Großverbraucher
we put
wären
it?
eine schöne
Large
Lösung,
consumers
möglicherweise im
would be
privaten
a
Bereich
good
eine
solution. In the private
dedizierte
area, you've got
Wärmepumpe
the
oder auch eine Wallbox für das
heat pump
Elektroauto.
or
Auch der
wall
eine oder
box
andere
for
industrielle
an
Verbraucher wird
electric
sich
car,
sicherlich freuen,
and some
über erneuerbaren
industrial
Strom auch die eigene Dekarbonisierung
users would
voranzubringen.
also be happy to use
Andererseits
the
möchten
electricity for
diese Leute
their
ja
own
auch ihren Abnehmer
decarbonization.
sehr
But on the
konstant
other
zur Verfügung
hand,
Strom und das
the
ist manchmal eben auch zur Unzeit, wenn
people
gerade keine
want
Sonne scheint oder kein Wind weht.
electricity at all times,
Insofern
even if there is
gibt es
no
weiterhin
wind and
Abregelungen
no
und
sun.
Redispatch
And thus
und
we
eben
still have
Kosten,
cutoff
die damit
and
auch verbunden sind.
redispatch and the resulting costs.
Insofern, man sieht, es gibt noch an sehr vielen
So you
Stellen
can see that
Ineffizienzen im
we still
System.
have a number of
Gleichzeitig
inefficiencies
wird
in
aber
the
auch
system,
deutlich, dass ein
but at the same
stabiles und gut
time, it is
ausgebautes
becoming
Netz
clear
für die
that a
Energiewende
stable and
ja
well-designed grid
Grundvoraussetzung ist.
is a prerequisite for a
Unsere
successful
heutige
energy
Teilnahme
transition.
zeigt, wie groß das Interesse
Your
in der
participation
gesamten Branche
today
ist
shows that there
und
is
auch,
a high
dass großer
interest
Diskussionsbedarf
and a
dazu
need
besteht,
to
wie wir denn
discuss
die Netze
how the
mitmachen für
grids
diese ganzen
can be
Anforderungen
designed
für
to
die
meet the
Energiewende.
requirements of the energy
Darüber werden wir
transition
heute
in the
sprechen
future.
und einiges
This is
an
what we want
Fragen, an
to
offenen Punkten
discuss
klären.
today, and we want to
Deshalb begrüße
clarify
ich Sie
some
ganz
of the
herzlich
open
zum E-World
issues.
Kickoff.
So
Schön,
let
dass
me
Sie dabei sind.
welcome you cordially for the
Mein
first
Name ist
day
Anne
of
Burs,
our
ich leite den
eWorld Kickoff
Programmbereich der
event.
E-World und ich freue mich sehr,
My
dass wir
name
die
is Anne
ungefähr
Burs.
zwei
I'm heading the
Stunden
conference team
miteinander
at
verbringen können,
eWorld,
die
and
wir
I'm
uns
looking
zusammengestellt haben.
very much forward to spending the two
As
hours
eWorld,
with
we
you.
also have quite an international audience, so allow me to briefly switch into English. You being here shows how important it is what is going on in our grids, be it in Germany or abroad. So thank you very much for joining in and welcome to the eWorld Kickoff. My name is Anne. I am heading the eWorld conference team, and I am very much looking forward to spending the next about 2 hours together with you. Sie haben gerade gemerkt, ich bin zwischen Deutsch und Englisch gewechselt.
You
Wir haben
just noticed
einen
that
Stream
I
auf
switched from
Deutsch und
German
einen
into
Stream komplett auf
English.
Englisch für Sie
We
vorbereitet.
have one
Meine
stream in
Kollegin stellt
German
gerade
and
beide
another
Links in
stream
die,
for English, and
in den
my
Chat,
colleague is
damit Sie wechseln können,
placing the
wenn Sie
information
möchten,
into the
beziehungsweise
chat
das
so
können wir
that you
noch
can
schauen, wie es
change if you wish to
für
do
Sie am
so,
besten
and
ist.
you can always listen to your preferred language.
Die eWorld als Präsenzmesse startet ja etwa erst in ungefähr 3
eWorld
Monaten.
will
Wir haben
start in
jetzt schon
roughly
mal einen
3 months
digitalen
as a
Raum
live
geschaffen.
event, but we already
Sie sehen
created a
hier, was
digital
wir mit
space for
Ihnen
you, and
vorhaben.
here you can
Schön, dass Sie
see
dabei
what
sind.
we have
Ähm,
planned for you in the
Wir
next
haben
3
3
days. It's
Themen
great to
rausgesucht,
have
die die
you
Branche
here,
gerade unter
and we
anderem
picked
bewegen.
out 3 topics
Das
which
ist
are
heute
of interest in
das
the
Netz
industry
und
right
wie
now.
es dem Netz
Today we'll
jegliche
talk about
Regulierungen
the grid
für Stabilität
and
und Flexibilität
what
sorgen.
types of
Morgen
regulations
sprechen
will
wir über die
result in
Versorgungssicherheit
stability and
in Deutschland
flexibility.
und
Tomorrow
Europa.
we'll talk
Und am
about security of
Donnerstag,
supply in
da starten
Germany
wir schon
and
um
in
halb
Europe.
10,
And on
geht es um die
Thursday,
Finanzierung
where
der
we also
Netze.
start at
Die
9:30, we'll talk
Anmeldung
about the
haben Sie jetzt auch schon
financing
hervorragend gemeistert. Auch für die
of
nächsten
the
3 bis
heat
Tage gibt es
transition.
über die
The
eWorld Community und dann sind Sie
registration
also
is
hoffentlich dort dabei.
based on the eWorld
Würde mich freuen,
community,
Sie
and you can
wiederzusehen.
register for all the events. I
Heute
would be happy
allerdings
if I saw you again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow.
sprechen
Today,
wir
however,
sprechen wir, beziehungsweise spricht erstmal Roman Dudenhausen mit
We
dem
first
Präsidenten
have
der
Roman
Bundesnetzagentur
Dudenhausen
und im Anschluss folgt
interviewing
dann
the
eine
president of the
Podiumsdiskussion
German
sehr
Federal
gewöhnlich wie
Network
hier.
Agency,
Es
and
geht
then we'll
um
have a panel
die Rolle
discussion.
von
Here you can see the
Flexibilitätsoptionen in
information. We'll
Netzen,
talk
aber
about
sicherlich
the
auch
role of
durch
flexibility
Netzausbau und
options in the
Netzpflege,
grids, but also
Netzinstandhaltung, wenn überhaupt
questions
finanziert
of
werden.
grid expansion,
Ja,
grid
etwa gegen 12
maintenance,
Uhr
and
beenden
how
wir
to
dann den heutigen
finance
Tag
this.
und sind
At
sicherlich
around 12
um
o'clock,
einige
we will close our
Antworten
discussion today, and
apropos
hopefully you have
Fragen.
gained some new
Fragen,
insights.
damit Sie
Now,
Antworten bekommen
questions.
auf die
Of
richtigen Fragen.
course, you
Fragen, die
can
Sie natürlich
ask
sehr gerne
questions
stellen.
to get the right
Nutzen Sie dafür am
answers,
besten den
and
Chat in der eWorld
you should
Community. Den
use
finden
the
Sie direkt
chat
neben
in
der
the
Einbettung
eWorld
des
community. You'll
Videos.
find
Wir haben
it
das im Blick und
right
werden die
next to
Fragen
the
dann auch gerne
video,
eingeben in den Chat.
and we will always check the
Genau,
chat
da Sie mich jetzt
and
hier auch in
pass
einem
on your
YouTube-Stream
questions.
sehen, seien Sie
As you
versichert,
now
es
see
bleibt
me in a YouTube
aufgezeichnet.
stream,
Sie können es
I
gerne
can
nochmal
assure
nachschauen
you
und
that
natürlich auch
the
sehr, sehr
event will
gerne
be recorded,
teilen
so you can look at
an die
it later
Personen, die
again,
das
and you
sehr
can
reizvoll
also
finden.
share it with people who
Der
might
Link
also
bleibt
be
ja ebenfalls auf
interested in
derselben
our
Seite.
discussion. The link will be the
Damit jetzt
same
aber
as the
genug
one
der
you used to dial
Vorrede.
in.
Ich würde gerne einsteigen in das
But that's
heutige
enough
Programm.
as some
Ich habe es gerade schon
organizational comments.
gespoilert.
Let's
Unser
now start
allererster
with
Gast
today's
blickt
program. I already
zurück auf
told
eine
you
etwa
our
8-jährige
first guest
politische Karriere,
has
sowohl auf
spent
Bundes- als auch auf
8 years as a
Landesebene.
politician at federal
War
and state
vorher auch
levels. Before
Interessensvertreter
that,
von
he
Verbraucherinnen und
represented
Verbrauchern in
consumer
seiner Funktion
interests
als Leiter der
in his
Verbraucherzentrale NRW.
function as the head
Heute
of
ist
the
er aber
consumer
Präsident der
organization North
BNetzA-Agentur
Rhine-Westphalia,
und
but
unter
today he is
anderem
the president of
zuständig
the
für die
Federal
Regulierung
Network
des
Agency in
Energiemarktes.
Germany, and he is,
Roman
amongst
Dudenhausen
others,
ist
responsible
Vorstand der
for the regulation of
VNetzA.g
the
und
electricity
heute
grids in
sozusagen mein
Germany. Roman
Korrespondent der Bonn.
Dudenhausen
Er hat
is
mit mir vor.
CEO of ConEnergy AG and my lead correspondent today. He talked to Klaus Müller.
Der eWorld, die wir nächstes Jahr im Februar dann auch wieder in live und in Person in Essen erleben werden. Aber erstmal freue ich mich, dass wir beide die Gelegenheit haben, heute einige Themen vorab zu besprechen, bevor wir dann im Anschluss in eine Diskussion gehen mit weiteren Experten und Kollegen aus der Branche.
For an
Und
interview
natürlich
before we
ist
continue
die
with the
Vorbereitung
discussion
fast
with
hilfreich.
other experts in the industry. And of course, everything I had prepared became more or less obsolete in view of what has happened in the past few weeks. And you will not be surprised about my first question. What does this mean for you and the agency? Everything that we have seen so far, the government crisis and the general elections that we will see in February. What will this mean for the Federal Network Agency, and what will this mean for the energy industry in general? Well, luckily, changes in the government do not really directly affect an agency like ours. The legislator, for good reasons and also due to European requirements, decided to grant us far-reaching independence, and this means that questions regarding grid regulation, hydrogen, approval processes, here the agency will work at high speed as it did before the changes, but there will, of course, be some effects. As far as we know today, there will be no approved federal budget for the year 2025, and this will have an impact on the entire government, including the Federal Network Agency, regarding, for example, staffing. And what is even more important, the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection still has a high number of draft laws it wanted to pass. The final 9 months of the government's term of office would have meant a lot of work. Just think of questions such as power plant capacities, acceleration of grid expansion, but also solar peaks. These are all topics which are urgent, and we are still hopeful that things will continue to develop in the new constellation. Otherwise, it will be a busy start for the new minister. Will things be left undone? No, definitely not. Here in Bonn, we will continue to work full speed, but there will be some delays. Let's just assume everybody knows that Germany is in urgent need of power plant capacities. This is more or less agreed in the government, has been discussed with Brussels. There were consultations with civil society, science, and the economy. And if the Planned Power Plant Act will not come as planned, we will lose 6 months or more. And as the Federal Network Agency had already been ready to prepare the tendering processes, but the tenders can only be organized on the basis of an act. Some delays are inevitable, and this, of course, means problems for the investors, stress for the entire system, but it does not mean that things will be left undone. They will be delayed. Do you expect a new government, whatever parties will be part of it and which colors it will include, to exert a significant influence on the current regulation in Germany, or do you only expect minor changes here? Well, this is, of course, a question for the people to decide. The voters will decide on the basis of their preferences, and it is not the role of an agency to comment on political programs. But it is a fact, of course, that we are facing a number of challenges. There is political continuity in Germany, and I think everybody is grateful for that. And there are, of course, also internationally binding contracts we have to comply with. The climate agreements of Paris will be relevant to the actions of any government, but this also includes some challenges. First of all, how can we expand renewable energies in a fast and cost-efficient manner? How can we ensure that the connection to the grid regionally, but also locally, as people want to be part of the energy transition, no matter where you live geographically? So how can we connect people to the grid speedily? The digitalization of the grid is inevitable, and we can hardly claim that Germany is a pioneer here. We rather have to catch up here. And also storages and flexibilities, how to integrate them smartly and how to design a system which guarantees supplies 24/7 at each millisecond. These are all points which have to be tackled anyway. What I do expect, however, is that there will be a stronger emphasis on cost efficiencies. The grid, the gas crisis has perhaps shifted some of the priorities, but it is deeply rooted in the DNA of the Federal Network Agency, and we will make our contribution, no matter which party will rule the country. Well, one of the many topics that you touched upon is, of course, very important in the election campaign as well. Everybody is talking about the grid fees. And I sometimes wonder, is it really the biggest problem that we are facing right now? And don't we really have import and generation problem, or is it just enough to reduce grid fees and then we have electricity prices again, which are enormously competitive? That always depends on the benchmark you use. For private household customers, the Federal Network Agency has been publishing a monitor where we show the current prices based on prices of 2021, and we can see for households, for new customers who changed suppliers recently, we are more or less back to the level of 2021. For industrial customers, we are also preparing this, and here, depending on the industry, we see that there were very positive measures. But the problem is, if you use the US as a benchmark, it is hard to match what is happening there. The structures in the United States, also the qualities regarding interruptions of supply, risks, natural disasters cannot simply be compared to our situation. Thus, the question always is, what is the benchmark and am I in a competitive situation? For this reason, the discussion in public and in the economy very much focuses on energy intensity intensive industries. And if we want to keep these industries in Germany, and the answer can only be yes, then the electricity prices have to be changed, and grid fees are a major chunk to be tackled. But we do not confirm some of the forecasts that you read. Sometimes I read that the grid fees will double again. But in our view of the investment figures and systems costs do not confirm this. But of course, we do want to invest. We have to invest, and this will be reflected. And this is why we supported the government when it wanted to spend 5.5 billion euros to support grid fees a year ago. We know that after the Karlsruhe decision, this was no longer possible. The discussion is still ongoing. And as an immediate measure, this is right. Otherwise, you have to find cost reduction potential in the system. And this means acceleration of the grid expansion to reduce redispatch costs. Well, it is not directly your sphere of decision, but if you talk about competitiveness of energy-intensive industries, would it be sufficient to reduce grid fees, or isn't the electricity price advantage on the commodity side so high that it would be difficult to ensure competitiveness on the energy cost side? Well, if you do a deep dive in the discussion, you will see that there are many facets. On the one hand, we have to talk about energy efficiency. What is the real share of energy costs in my value generation? And here I see companies, smaller and larger ones, who, due to their technology leadership, are excellent in their segment. But nevertheless, you talked about energy efficient industries, and there are two major cost elements. First, generation, but I am told by many companies that by PPAs or other instruments, they already generate cost advantages through renewable energies. This is good already. It is reliable, cost efficient, and renewable, climate neutral, and this is what many investors demand today. But then there will also be the less foreseeable block of grid and systems costs. And this is why we have this suggestion of the grid operators, BDW, VKEU, to take out costs that are incurred in the transformation. And this is a decision to be taken by the budget legislation. But again, for us, it is important to take out costs in the system that are related to delays in grid expansion, redispatch costs, for example, that these are reduced as quickly as possible. And we have seen that grid expansion in Germany has gained speed. First measures are taken, new measures start every 2 weeks, and we have already seen first sections that can go live, and Amplion has informed us about huge successes in terms of reducing redispatch costs, but we are successful, but we are not at the goal yet, and we have to keep on going. In this context, are you concerned about the current reduction in electricity demands? Because it is clear that costs need to be distributed, and if the distribution is among fewer players, it's more difficult. Do you see this as a long-term problem? That Germany has a cyclical problem is undenied, and that Germany has structural deficits has been admitted by politicians of all leanings. And the reduced energy demand now is a consequence. I am firmly convinced that the next federal government will push this topic. The EU Commission will take this up to enable progress. And so I think that the dip in energy demand that we currently see is only temporary. Grid expansion is a project for years, and it would definitely be wrong to stop the expansion of renewables, the debate about storage and flexibilities, just because we have seen this significant problem for 2 or 3 years now. Politicians will have to plan long term, and we in our agency are doing this anyway. But what is also right for the current electricity costs is that this is a fractional algorithm, numerators and denominators, like we learned it in school. And if I distribute the electricity price among fewer people, my electricity price will be higher than expected. And so I do understand the current discussions around this problem. This is why we have the discussion around grid fee subsidies. This is why we discuss about being more cost efficient, and not only in theory, but in practice. First, I'm pleased that you are not absolutely negative looking at the gray skies. We should not only see things in a negative, but in a positive light. But it also brings me to another topic, and this is hydrogen. As for many other topics, we first have seen a hype on this topic, but many topics are first hyped, then they are put into perspective, and then this leads to a more reasonable and better and more professional approach. What is your current view on hydrogen, the hydrogen core net, and also the question around the importance of hydrogen as part of the energy system? All serious scientists and entrepreneurs know and also say that on the way to a climate neutral society, enormous amounts of energy have to be transported, and we have to create a power grid to transfer all these electrons. But we can't build such a huge grid. And so from a physical and a chemical point of view, I need another energy carrier. For many decades, it has been molecules, fossil, natural gas in the past. And this also in the context of the Paris agreements can no longer be a durable solution. This is a consensus among almost everybody. And so we have agreed on hydrogen, first of all, in many different colors, in the long run, rather green hydrogen. And I can still remember the discussion about the hen and the egg problem that I have led for 10 or 15 years. We'll first see generation and consumption, or first the grid. This was a decision taken by the government, the chancellor, the minister for the economy around a year ago. They said Germany will be taking the lead. Thus, Germany was the third country in Europe, next to Belgium and the Netherlands, which are a little smaller, to now have a law. We have a decision by the Federal Network Agency, and we have an approved hydrogen core net, and also a development plan to be able to close gaps and make the grid breathe. At this point, I see that the federal government was courageous to take the risk of the amortization account to enable hydrogen technology. And now we are facing this new mood, the new wave, where I see more concerns and worries. That's legitimate, that's okay, because after every euphoria, there needs to be a phase of disillusionment. But we see many plans in the power plant environment by public utilities, industrial companies, and so on and so forth, who say that it's good that we now have the core net. We assume that the first excavators will move, and we will have the first building taking place in the first quarter 2025. And then we will check whether the net has the right dimensions, and the net can be more fine meshed and thus larger. But it is also the task of the Federal Network Agency to be careful about costs and check the lines. And then we will prepare and implement the grid in such a way that in a few years' time, we will have a totally different debate, economically speaking. We will have seen more technological progress. The power plant strategy will be established, and we can then say, if now the capacities are being built, the grid will already be there.
So you're not so worried about the pricing debate on hydrogen. That's going to be the next big task for the Federal Network Agency. That's what they call the fee for ramp up. But I think the federal government has made a very smart decision regarding this issue. They said we will not share the cost, which would be a prohibition-like approach for the ramp up of the hydrogen technologies, but there will be intermediate financing and the fee will be determined by the federal government. And as always, for a regulator, we are somewhere between a rock and a hard place. Some want higher interest rates, higher costs, higher fees, and then there is the industry, the public utilities, who would like the final fee to be rather lower. So we have to make a final decision. We want to make a suggestion before Christmas and then have consultations next year. Well, that's going to be rather soon. That's good. You mentioned PPA, however, earlier. So let's go back to that. In the middle of the year 2026, CFDs are also to be implemented. So what's the role of PPAs and CFDs, and where does your authority tend to go? Mostly it's an entrepreneurial question. The subsidies for renewable energies have to be more cost efficient. I think somewhere in the future, historians will really praise Germany for the legislation that allowed for a global breakthrough of renewable energies like solar and wind power. Of course, right now, this is all a bit in the dark and difficult to understand, but one day in the future, it will be understood. But this also means a huge responsibility. And of course, financing this has to be more efficient. This was the idea for the reenactment of the Renewable Energies Act. This will now be probably delayed, maybe half a year later. But many companies want to be secure in their planning and budgeting and scheduling already. So let's look at the PPAs that are already there. The European Union has set up the framework. The Federal Republic of Germany will move within those parameters, and we as a regulatory authority will, of course, make adjustments wherever necessary. Our invitations to tender will be adjusted. We got fantastic results for our projects, or rather tenders in the field of solar energy. But of course, cost-efficient electricity also needs to be translated into practice. For wind power, the tendering processes took quite some time. And of course, this is cost-intensive. But if we go down that road, Germany can meet the objective of getting to the 80% share of renewable energies in one of the next years to come. Now let's look at the distribution systems. We have more and more integration, more and more smaller scale feed in. We need charging points for electric vehicles. And this will only work with a higher degree of digitization. You already mentioned redispatching. And of course, this is a big challenge for the grids. So can they all do it and bear it? And do we have to go down to this level of detail? Do you have to look at this in such a sophisticated way? Or can you maybe be a bit more generous from the viewpoint of a distribution system operator? They all have different views of this. What is yours? Well, your question has actually touched upon all the concerns of the Federal Network Agency. First, we have now this instrument of regional scenarios, which allows us to look beyond the boundaries of the approximately 900 DSOs. So we can see, or grid operators, so we can go beyond that. In the past months, on top of that, we have communicated a lot in order to make sure that the the legal foundations and the perspective allow for a future expansion of the grid. And the time of hesitating and waiting is over. And you have also said it, there is the need, there is the wish to have solar panels on your private roof or on the roof of the local supermarket, on some factory building. So this is really a bottom-up demand, and not only in the south of Germany any longer. And then we have increasing demand for heat pumps, for wall boxes, etc., etc. So this is one of the driving forces behind grid expansion, which is already at the local level and is really taking us all to the boundary of what we're able to do. The grid operators need to do more. They are in demand even beyond of what they can do. And this will be even tougher when we have standardization, when grid operators increase the degree of digitization. We already saw the new figures for smart meter rollouts as published by grid operators. This is not yet excellent. We need more improvement there. And it's easy, of course, if you don't have to do this almost 900 times, but if you can do it in a unified manner at a more organized level. And that's what we want to make easier. And there should also be financial incentives. We want to create a bonus payment for excellence in energy transition. So if you are a better grid operator, this should be worth your while. So it's coming from the bottom up. It's important to look towards the future, and grid expansion is important. I think I have to follow up here. Basically, what you're saying is, and I agree with that, we do need these small generators. We have more consumers, so we have a broader spread of the grid fees. We need the consumers like heat pumps, so we should really embrace the possibility of integrating them with the system. Yes, and we have Section 14A, which took quite some time, but the Federal Network Agency has now transposed it into practice, and we have set up the regulatory parameters for everything you mentioned. So we have strong incentives and even requirements for digitization of distribution systems. Plus, we have security in planning for low grid costs. And as the distribution system operators implement this, we are monitoring it. Well, it's difficult for storage unit operators because they have to pay double. At the same time, they are ready to pay something. So how do you deal with that issue? Well, we see a fascinating growth of storage capacities that is driven by the market. In energy policies as well as other areas of politics, there's always the demand for subsidies. But basically, we should, theoretically speaking, have an energy sector that works without subsidies. Now, for 12 to 18 months, we have seen a lot of cost digression, but also ups and downs in the pricing for electricity. The evolution of business models was to be observed, and storage units were expanded. And then there is what you said, that some pay double grid fees to be paid. We always asked, who is paying double fees? This is not reality. If you use the grid once, you pay once. If someone else uses electricity, they pay the fee once. If you have something integrated, at your private household level or company's level, that's all fine anyway. So of course we need some continuation, and as of summer next year, we will have to discuss the general fee mechanisms. They have to be debated further, but this double payload is really not part of reality. Well, I have to follow up on something else now, otherwise too many people will follow up with me. We need to think along broader lines. You said more cooperation, not almost 900 different system operators. So the medium-sized public utilities will probably agree that this is too complex, and not everything happens at federal level, but some challenges can only be met if you are big enough. I don't think it's right what some claim, that the public utilities at the local and municipal level are dying, but how can we meet with this challenge? That is a challenge to be met at the entrepreneurial level, at the level of individual companies and operators. The Federal Network Agency will not claim the right number of system operators, whether it's 900 or more or less. That's not at our level. We, over the last months, saw huge efforts and excellent work done by system operators, but of course they are all different. Our approach is that digitalization, security of supply, etc., have to be provided at an excellent level everywhere in Germany. And of course, the distribution system operators ask for some kind of rewards. They want an incentive. And of course, that's just human. We know it from ourselves. And that's what the current regime does not offer. And that's why we made new proposals. We had consultations in October, and probably in January or February, this will be finalized. And there will be new consultations by the end of next year. We want this to be definitely final. So every grid operator or distribution system operator knows, if I do this, if I finance that, this is the reward I will have. But how many of them take us up on the offer is their decision. So system operators, transportation and transmission system operators at the European level, what can be done there? I mean, there are many gaps to be bridged when you look at the European level. Of course, first we have to look to our neighbors, the geographically closest countries. And from the German viewpoint, well, because of some things in the past, because of our deficiencies in the grid, we don't have the best reputations. We had to use neighboring grids, and they were not too happy about that. So that's why we have at the European level, it was triggered that we now have this clear allocation of the grid zones in Germany, because the neighbors will not be happy if we use up their capacities. Now, the acceleration of the grid expansion and the Federal Networks Agency focusing on the border crossing points, well, it all has to be taken into account when you look at the current situation with renewable energies, where you have dark clouds, where you have no wind and no sun, and of course also the bright periods. And we do have capacities. We have our own capacities, obviously, in Germany, but there are more favorably priced capacities outside Germany. So it is only reasonable to use those capacities as well, and to export and import according to the current situation. And the European electricity market makes the prices more efficient. And that's why we need these European mechanisms. And that's always been the point. The European version of this system has always focused very much on interlinked networks within Germany. Well, the grid and network infrastructure is the backbone of our whole system, of all the suppliers, and this is really valuable. But against that background, we have to ask about investments. How can I put this diplomatically? Can this not be somehow made a bit more attractive for investors? They always look at the returns on equity. They look for yields. So can it be somehow made more attractive so you have more money within the system? Maybe some kind of sovereign wealth fund in Germany that will help us pimp the grid? Well, I meet with system operators at a regular interval, and I meet with people from the chemical industries, mechanical engineering, paper, ceramics, etc., etc. And these industry players look for every penny when it comes to grid fees. And the same is true for consumer protectors. So someone has to pay the price. And when you have a normal market situation, you have supply and demand, and this regulates prices. It's textbook economy. But here, users and payers are not sitting at the negotiation table, but they are represented by the Federal Network Agency. So it is our task to be monitoring prices because somebody else is paying them. And currently, the German economy is undergoing a difficult time. We have only just discussed it. Electricity prices and grid fees are part of that. And every small percentage point in terms of returns on equity plays a role. So, of course, the focus is very much on the margins. However, the Federal Network Agency has now said we will make the system easier. That's why we have suggested a general system at the European level that will return yields to the system operators. And of course, there can be increases, there can be raises. We are watching the interest rate environment in Europe very closely. And of course, returns on equity were very much under pressure. And I have only just recently seen 3 different interest rate adjustments by Ms. Lagarde downwards. Now, of course, this triggers a simplification of the system, and a more moderate interest rate environment with a surcharge on cost of capital is a first aid measure. It makes investing in Germany very, very attractive. And we think we've done the right thing here. This has not come to an end. We're listening to the industry, we're listening to the rating agencies, to the exchanges. We look at the whole economic landscape, and all that expertise will help us make another decision next year, which we will also try to defend also on behalf of those who make investments in the grid, vis-à-vis those who have to make the payments. Mr. Müller, thank you very much. I think this has been a great introduction to our following panel discussion. Thank you.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zurück hier bei uns im Essener
Hello
Studio.
and welcome back
Entschuldigen Sie
to
bitte
our
die kurze
studio in Essen.
Verzögerung. Das Stühlerücken hat hier ein klein
Apologies
wenig länger
for the
gedauert,
slight
aber
delay.
jetzt sind
We
wir
took a little bit
bereit
longer to
und
get
ich bin nicht
everybody
mehr
in,
alleine
but
in
now
dem
we are
virtuellen Studio.
prepared and
Ich freue
I'm
mich
no
sehr, dass
longer
Sie ins
alone
Studio
in
gekommen
our
sind. Sie
virtual
gerade
studio,
auch
but
schon
I've
gesehen,
got some
aber
support.
jetzt auch
You
noch
already
mal
saw
festgesetzt
Mr.
habe. Hallo Roman.
Dudenhausen before, but now
grüße
he
dich.
is here
Schön, dass du da bist.
personally. Hello,
Ich
Roman.
dachte, wir starten mal
Hello.
ganz kurz mit einem
I
Mini-Ausblick auf
thought it would be
eWorld, die wir ja
great
hier mit
to
dieser
start with
Veranstaltung
an
starten.
outlook to
Ganz kurz
eWorld,
Entweder-Oder-Frage.
which will start
Wenn wir
soon.
in ungefähr
Just a few
83 Tagen
questions.
von
When
die
we
Tour
start
der
eWorld
eWorld
in
2025 öffnen,
83
bist du auf
days,
Sneakern oder auf Anzugsschuhen
will
unterwegs?
you wear sneakers or
Sneaker.
dress shoes? Sneakers.
Weil
Okay,
ich muss lange stehen und viel laufen.
Because I have to walk and stand a lot.
das kann ich mir sehr gut
Yes, I
vorstellen.
can imagine.
Das führt mich zu meiner nächsten Frage. Du bist ja auch
This leads me
dann
to
in
the
vielen
next
Gesprächen
question. You will
unterwegs,
probably
häufiger
also
auf der
have many
Messe.
discussions
Hast du
during
denn
the
eine
show.
Lieblingsuhrzeit
Do you
für
have
Gespräche
a
auf der Messe?
favorite time of day for
Meine
appointments?
Lieblingsuhrzeit ist eigentlich
My favorite
der
time
letzte
of
Termin.
day is the
Weil
end
dann
of
die
the
eWorld
show,
hoffentlich
the
erfolgreich
last
hinter sich
appointment,
gebracht wurde.
because then
Der letzte
everything
Termin
was
jeden Tag und danach
successfully over.
gerne ein
No,
kühles Bier.
I always like the last
Das wird
appointment in a
also
day and
wer
then
jetzt gerade
look
dabei ist,
forward
sich
to
Termine zu
a nice
überlegen, das
beer.
wäre doch nur ein Überzeugungsargument,
Okay,
in die
well,
Nähe zu Roman
this is a
Dudenhausen zu kommen.
convincing argument to make an
Bonusfrage.
appointment with Roman Dudenhausen.
Letzte
And another
Frage, wo musst du
question,
dann auf der eWorld unbedingt gewesen sein?
where do you definitely have to go
Bei
during
den
the
Startups,
eWorld?
zu sehen,
I
was
have to go
alles
to
da
the
Neuem
startups
passiert.
in order to see what
Neue Themen
new
und auch,
is
ich glaube, ein
coming.
paar Dauerthemen haben wir jetzt
So,
auch gerade
some
schon, oder hast
new
du
topics
angesprochen im
and
Gespräch
some
mit
older
Klaus
topics
Müller,
were
der sich
already
gleich auch noch
mentioned in
dazu
your
schaltet. Das
discussion with
wäre so
Klaus
in
Müller,
Sinne.
who will join us
Bis
soon in
dahin
our
haben wir
little
aber auch
group
schon
of
noch weitere
panelists.
angekündigte
But we
Verstärkung von
have
3 anderen
some
Herren,
more
die
people
gerne mit dir
joining
jetzt ein
us,
Gespräch
and
und
they
eine
would like to
Diskussionsrunde
now have a discussion
führen.
with you.
Insofern überlasse ich euch gerne die Bühne
So
und bin
I
sehr
will
gespannt
now
auf die
leave
Diskussion.
the stage to you,
Ja,
and
vielen
I
Dank.
look forward to the
Und ich
discussion.
freue mich auch auf die
Thank
Diskussion.
you. I'm
Ich hatte
also
ein
looking
sehr
forward to our
entspanntes
discussion,
Vorgespräch mit
and
dem
I
Präsidenten der
already had
Bundesnetzagentur. Und ich glaube,
this
wir
exciting
müssen vielleicht dann
interview with the
einstellen, ob Sie
president of the
Einstieg
Federal
sind. Das
Network
wird uns ja auch
Agency, and I
langweilig.
think we have
Und
to
dafür
get
haben wir, glaube ich,
into
ein
some of the
sehr schönes
contents
Panel hier
again, and I
zusammengestellt.
think we've
Und
got an
ich
excellent
gehe
panel
dem Alphabet
for
nach.
you.
Ich freue mich,
Let me
dass der Robert
start
Busch da ist, der
in
Geschäftsführer
alphabetical
vom
order and
Bundesverband Neue
welcome first
Energiewirtschaft.
Robert Busch, the
Thomas
Managing
König,
Director of the
CEO
Association of
Netze
Energy
von
Market
E.ON.
Innovators,
Und
BNE,
Christoph Müller,
Dr. Thomas
Mitglied der
König,
Geschäftsführung von
COO
Amprion.
Grids von
Und
E.ON,
ich
and
denke, wir
Christoph
drei
Müller,
werden schon mal loslegen
member of
und
the
geben dann,
board of Amprion.
haben dann schon
We
mal ein
will
bisschen
start
Energie
already,
reingepumpt in die
and
Diskussion.
we
Und
can
die
already take
Mustern
up
der Klaus
some
Müller an der
speed,
Seite
and
reinkommen. Mal
Klaus
gucken, ob wir
Müller,
ihn
when
dann schon
he
mal ein
joins us, will
bisschen
then
piesackeln
have
können.
to
Als
make
wir die ganze
do
Veranstaltung
with what
geplant
we
haben,
have
da
done
sah die Welt noch
and
ein bisschen anders aus.
expect our
Da sind wir
questions.
noch auf der
Well,
britischen
when
Ebene.
we
Wir
planned
hatten eine
this
andere
event,
Regierung
the
in den
world was still looking
USA,
differently.
beziehungsweise
We had a
haben wir ja
different
noch die alte
government in the
Regierung,
United
das war vor der
States.
Trump-Wahl.
Well, we still
Aber
have
vor allem
the
hatten wir auch
old government,
in
but it was
Deutschland noch
before
die
Trump was
Vermutung, dass die Bundesregierung
re-elected. And
bis
in
zum
Germany, we
September
also had
durchhält.
the assumption
Und
that the
jetzt
federal
haben wir am
government would
23.
be in
Februar
place until
Neuwahlen. Vielleicht einfach
September,
mal so ein
but
bisschen als
now we'll
Warm-up.
have general
Das
elections
interessiert,
in
glaube ich, auch
February.
viele
So, as a
wie
warm up,
ihr so
I
das
think many
Thema,
people will be
was kann denn da
interested in
auf uns
hearing your
zukommen, wie ihr
opinion
da
on what we have to
Riesenveränderungen seht oder
expect.
ob ihr sagt, nee,
Will
das
there
wird im
be major
Prinzip
changes,
so
or
weiter
will you
so. Vielleicht
say,
fangen wir jetzt
well,
einfach mal
this will
mit
just
Robert mit dir
continue
an und
as
gehen das einfach
always?
mal
Robert,
die
perhaps we
Reihe
can
einmal durch.
start
Das
with
würde ich
you
nämlich einen
and
schönen
then ask
Auftakt.
all the panelists as a
Ja, was
kickoff
erwarte ich? Also, wenn ich
question.
weiß, wer die Wahl gewinnt, kann ich auch sagen, was ich
Well, what
erwarte.
are my
Das
expectations?
weiß ich
Well,
ja
if
aber
I
nicht.
knew who
Sagen wir mal
will
so,
wins the election, then I could
nach
tell you
Überzeugung
what I
dessen, was man
expect,
hier in
but
der
I don't
Berliner
know.
Blase so wahrnimmt,
And
wird es
based
ja ein
on
paar
what we
Veränderungen
hear
geben
in
und
Berlin, there
einige
will
werden
be some
kommen
major
dazu, vielleicht
changes
einige sind nicht mehr dabei.
happening, and some people
Aber alle, die sich jetzt schon
who are
geäußert
in the
haben, haben ja
government
in ihren
may
Programmen,
no
in
longer
ihren,
be part of the government
wie
in
soll
the
man sagen,
future,
dem, was sie
but
erreichen wollen,
well,
vieles auch
we
erhalten.
have
Also ich habe ja auch
heard
kein
a
Programm, also
lot
von den
about
demokratischen
a
Parteien,
lot
auch
of
kein Programm
discussions. I do
gelesen,
not
wo man
have
sagt, die
any party
Energiewende muss
program
angehalten
yet.
werden,
I
Erneuerbare
have
und
not
das sollte
seen
so ähnlich ist, was wir
anybody
da in
saying
Amerika
the
sehen,
energy
will, wie es
transition
ist, glaubt
now
ja, glaube ich,
has to
niemand.
be
Insofern
stopped.
erwarte ich
This is something that we don't hear here. So I think we will have continuity, and I know that the industry and the consumers also hope that we'll continue on our decarbonization path and that we are doing the right thing with renewable energies. So this is something that we will probably see in the future. Thomas, I share what Mr. Bush already said, but let me take one step back. This year, we also saw the massive impact of climate change, and climate change is not interested in any elections, not in the United States, not in Germany. The basic problems will still be the same. We have to move away from fossil fuels, we have to go for renewables, and this is a stable and sustainable trend which will continue. I do expect indirect changes. Let's talk about the elections in the United States. Donald Trump made it clear, just to mention one example, that Europe has to invest much more itself in order to ensure defense of Europe. And this will, of course, be a burden on the budgets in Europe. And I think we will have very intensive discussions on how to distribute the money. And I could also imagine that the energy systems will probably get less money in the future, or at least that the payments will be delayed. So it's, of course, also depending on who will lead the government in the future, who will be part of the coalition government. But I do not expect immediate changes, but in the mid-run and in the long run, we have to see what we can do about money. The grid operators, I looked at the party program of the CSU and of the SPD. Both clearly say that we have to focus on the expansion of the grid. We have to set the right incentives. And this is something that probably will not change next year. Mr. Müller? Well, let me continue here and let me come back to what the two previous speakers said. The mega trend of the climate change will, of course, be very important for the political debates. The polls will still lose their eyes, and we will still see major storms and natural disasters. So the problems will stay the same and the tasks will not change. So we will have to phase out coal, but in order to do this, we also have to find new energies, and the Power Plant Act will still be high on the agenda. And also the debates about redistribution of money. Mr. König said that this will be shaping the political debates, but this is also important for us as an industry. We have to talk about who is causing costs for the grid fees. To just continue as we always did in the past will not lead us anywhere. So we'll have to check who is causing the costs in the grid, but also this means that we have to redistribute the costs, and we also have to make sure that there will be financial stability and financial power of the TSOs and the DSOs. These were a number of excellent comments already, and this brings me to the topic of the panel. Can the grid bear the energy transition? And I think this is one question that we should discuss today. The demands regarding the grid are increasing. Everything needs to be controlled. Everything needs to be measurable. We see more and more consumers participating in the grid. And at the same time, we have to make it possible, technologically speaking, and the grid fees should be reduced without subsidizing any costs. This is something that Mr. König already said. I now have to understand how this can work. I haven't really understood this. And perhaps we can start it the other way around. Let's start with the TSOs.
konkret, was ich mit Umverteilung meinte oder mit den
Well,
Netzentgelten?
what do you mean?
Wie das
What I
funktionieren
mean
soll,
with
dass wir die
the
Netze
grid
immer mehr
fees, now,
ausbauen, die
how can it
Komplexität,
work that we
technische
expand the
Komplexität erhöhen,
grids,
was ja auch
that
sinnvoll sein kann und
the
gleichzeitig, was Sie auch gesagt
everyday
haben,
complexity is
sollen die
rising
Netzentgelte
over
nicht
and
steigen und da passt
again,
nicht
but
das
at the
Thema
same
rein,
time, the grid fees should
wo
not
legen wir die Netzentgelte
increase.
eigentlich dann
So
ohne Subventionen einfach
what
reinzugeben?
can we do
Also das
without
eine an der Stelle, da
subsidies?
sollten wir uns nichts vormachen, Netzausbau
Well, we
kostet
should not
Geld.
deceive
Ja, der
ourselves.
Kapitaldienst
Grid
bei den
expansion will
Verteilnetzbetreibern
cost
und
money,
Übertragungsnetzbetreibern
and
wird
for the
steigen. Das kann es
DSOs and
natürlich,
the
wenn man die jetzt Die Frage an der
DSOs, there
Stelle,
will
wenn wir dann
be
auf die hohen
more
Netzentgelte gucken,
financing needs. But if you take a
ist mir
look
immer
at the
wichtig
high
zu
grid fees,
differenzieren. Was
it's
ist
always
eigentlich von
important
den
to make a
Verteilnetzbetreibern,
difference
von den
between
Übertragungsnetzbetreibern
what
ausgelöst und was
is
kommt
triggered by the
woanders?
DSOs
Also
and
wir
the
haben zum Beispiel
TSOs and what comes
Übertragungsnetzentgelt
from a
in
different area.
2024
For the
einen
grid fee
Großeinbetrag
in
von einer
the
Milliarde Euro,
distribution
knapp einer
network, we
Milliarde
now
Euro
have
für
an amount
Reservekraft.
of 1 billion
Das hat jetzt
euros
eigentlich erstmal überhaupt nichts mit dem
that
Übertragungsnetz zu tun. Wir haben uns aber
for investments that
entschieden,
don't have anything to
diese
do with the
Zahlung an
distribution
Kraftwerke, die
system.
wir für die
But
Versorgung
we
des Netzes
said
notwendig
the
erachten, über das Netzentgelt
payments
zu ziehen. Und da
that
kommen wir
are
an Themen, wo
necessary
weil das
for
Netzentgelt ist
the power
sozial
plants
unterfinanziert.
will be taken from the
Ne?
grid fee.
5000
But
Kilowattstunden sind
then
5000
it's not
Kilowattstunden, egal ob
reflected.
das jetzt eine
5,000
fünfköpfige
kilowatt hours are
Familie mit
5,000
Kernwohnung
kilowatt
ist
hours, no
oder ob
matter whether
das
it's a family
die
living in
Zahnarztvilla, also die Fabrikantenvilla
housing
mit PV auf
estate
dem
or
Dach
whether
und
it is a single
einer
parent,
Batterie
a
im
single
Keller. Das sind
family
immer 5000,
home
5000
with a
Kilowattstunden. Also das Netzentgelt
huge floor
ist in dem Sinne
space,
sozial
it's
undifferenziert.
all the same, and the
Und ich glaube,
payments
wir
are
müssen
also
gucken,
the
dass wir auch
same.
verursachungsgerecht sind,
And we also
weil
have to make
auf
sure
der
that
Villa, in der
we
Villa mit
base
PV auf
this
dem
on
Dach
who costs it.
und
Because in a
Batterie
large
im
home
Keller
with
wird
PV
an einem
system on the roof
in einer
and
dunklen Woche, wie wir es jetzt gerade
with
erlebt haben,
a
mit wenig
battery
Wind,
or
wird das Netz
storage
natürlich noch
in the
genutzt wie immer,
basement, well, they
tatsächlich
will
aber nicht wie
use
immer
the
bezahlt,
grid
sondern
as
nur noch
always, but
anteilig
they
sehr
do not want to
gering.
pay it,
Und
but they
da
will
ist eine
only pay very
Entsolidarisierung und Beispiele wie diese kriegen wir
few
auf eine
grid
Spannungssicht.
fees because
Das
they
heißt,
produce
wir müssen uns darauf
themselves.
einstellen, der Kapitaldienst
And here
steigt,
we
aber wir
have
müssen
to
gucken,
make
dass wir netzfremde
see
Kosten
that
aus dem
interest
Netz
will go
entfernen
up, but
und wir müssen gucken,
or
dass wir
debt
das
servicing will go
Verursachungsprinzip
up, and we have to make sure
Verkehrsverkehr
that
ziehen.
we
Schalten wir zum
see the
Verteilnetz.
payer, the causer,
Bei uns sieht die
paying the
Situation
brunt of
natürlich
this.
ähnlich aus.
Well, for us,
Also
the
insofern
situation
kann ich
is
alle
similar, of
Punkte, die
course,
Herr
and
Müller
I
gerade
can
vorgetragen
only
hat, nur
subscribe to
unterstreichen.
everything that
Ich will
Mr.
aber noch mal eins
Müller
sagen,
from
Roman, ich freue mich natürlich über jeden
Embryon
Kunden
has
im
just
Netz. Ob
said.
das
But
eine
Roman, I'm of course happy
Neuanlage
about
ist, die
every
einspeist
new
oder eine
consumer,
neue
whether this
Wärmepumpe
is a
oder
renewable
eine neue Wallbox.
energy
Das
plant
macht mir
or
als
a new wall
Netzbetreiber erstmal
box
grundsätzlich
or
Spaß.
what have
Wir
you. This
können
is something that
wachsen
I
und
like.
damit
We
die
can grow,
Energiewende
and this
realisieren.
means
Das
that
finde
we
ich
can
erstmal richtig
implement the
klasse.
energy
Auf der
transition.
anderen
So I
Seite
like
hat,
this.
erinnert mich
On
das
the
in
other
meiner
hand,
Einleitung so ein
this
bisschen
reminds me a
drück mir den
little
Pelz,
bit
aber mach mich nicht
of,
nass. Also das
well,
Netz
I
kann
want
immer wieder neue
to
Aufgaben
wash
übernehmen.
my fur, but
Ich
I
sag mal,
don't
wir
want
können
to
nicht
get
das,
wet in the
die
process.
Leistungsfähigkeit
So
unseres
we
heute
cannot
existierenden
expect the
Tankstellennetzes zusätzlich
performance of
übernehmen
the
und die Leistung, die
grid
heute
to be the
fossilbetriebene
same
Wärme
as the one that we had in the past.
ebenfalls ins Stromnetz integrieren und dann
So we
sagen,
can't
aber die
integrate
Kosten
everything
dürfen nicht
into
steigen.
the
Das
electricity
ist
grid
natürlich ein
without
Unding
rising
und wir müssen
costs.
uns, und da
This
bin ich
will not be
genau bei Herrn
possible. And
Müller,
now
über
I
zwei Dinge
am coming
Gedanken
back to what
machen.
Mr. Müller
Wer
said. We
ist
have to think about two
Kostenverursacher
aspects.
und
First of all,
sind
who
alle
causes the
Kostenverursacher,
costs, and
beteiligen die sich
are all
solidarisch
the
an der
people
Finanzierung
causing costs
der Netze und zum Zweiten
participating
gibt es nicht
in the
Möglichkeiten,
financing of the grids
die
on
Energiekosten in Summe zu
according to the
reduzieren.
principle
Da kann
of
ich natürlich
solidarity.
auf die
And what else
Perspektive
can we
der
do?
Industrie
And
gut
here
nachvollziehen.
I can really
Und
understand
vielleicht gucken wir uns
the
noch mal den
view of
Strompreis
the
an.
industrial players.
Also
Let's
die
take a look at
Steuern und Abgaben sind
the
immer noch
electricity
höher
price.
als die
Taxes and
Nutzungsentgelte.
tariffs
Stehen
are
überhaupt gar
still
nicht auf dem
higher
Blatt.
than the grid
Also da
fees,
kann
and
die
nobody is
Regierung
ever
immer
talking
einfach
about
bei den
it.
Steuern
So the
anfangen.
government
Und wenn wir
can
in
start reducing
Richtung der
taxes.
Strukturentgelte
And if
gucken,
we
dann
then
wird von
talk
Herrn Müller auch
about the grid
gerade die über
fees,
1 Milliarde für
Mr.
die
Müller
Reservekraftwerke
mentioned
genannt.
the 1 billion
Wir
for
haben in den
the
letzten
power
4 Jahren, wenn ich die
plants.
Zahlen halbwegs
In
im
the
Kopf habe,
past
10
4 years,
Milliarden
if I
Euro
remember correctly,
für
we spent
Redispatch
10
ausgegeben.
billion euros
Die
for
Prognosen
redispatch.
der
And the forecasts
Übertragungsnetzbetreiber,
for
die sind
of
zwar im
the
Vergleich zur alten Prognose gefallen,
TSOs went down because the wholesale prices are different now, but the volumes are increasing, and the forecast for 25 2025 is at 4 billion and 4.5 billion for 2026. So it's on the rise again. And from my point of view, these are political costs which simply stem from the fact that the expansion of the grids and the expansion of the renewable energies are not in synchronicity, are not in line. So we have to come up with new solutions. And well, these are already two major levers to reduce the grid fees quite considerably.
Over to you, Robert. What do you say? I say yes, but. Yes, but I've talked about this with several people already. So one question is, what kind of grid usage fee do we need? And the second question is, how do we share the cost? I think an article was only published yesterday about this, and I think we're all more or less in agreement here. In future, whether a business model is viable at the power market where players are not ready to pay grid usage fees, I cannot say, but we have a grid usage fee structure that is based on the volume of in kilowatt hours that are supplied. But if you base the fees instead on the infrastructure, you would have a flat rate amount for a connection of a certain property. It's like playing poker. You have to make a certain investment to be able to join a table. So, of course, grid usage fees, that's usually fixed overhead, a very large share of that, at least. And that's what I keep explaining to politicians. At the same time, you shouldn't be too quick to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Sometimes grid usage fees are paid by users, by customers, and by those who feed in. If you store, I don't think you pay twice. But anyway, what we need is a grid structure where everyone is on board. If you want to save on the levy or you want to make savings on the grid usage fee, you use a model that is not socially just and that cannot be sustainable. And this takes us to the question of how we handle this. Grid fees are supposed to be a blessing in terms of flexibility, but if those who have flexibility cannot pay the fees, something's wrong within the system. So we need a reform of the structure, capacity prices, infrastructure, connection. All these factors have to be made part of the pricing. At the same time, the grid operators have to put a price to their flexibility. Mr. Koenig, for instance, will know exactly what I'm talking about. Some will not really benefit from any kind of flexibility. Others will not be able to afford it. And of course, the price paid at the exchange cannot make us all happy because you will not have the right amounts of electricity at the right point in time, and fuses will be blown. We all know that. So we have a price risk correlation, which has to be made part of our calculations, but is everything that makes up the usage fee fair? I think 900 system operators are not really a good number. In the times when we brought it all back to the municipal level, 5 billion were already calculated. We now expect this to be rather 10 times as much. I think we were in a position, and I'm able to say this out loud, that the time of a turning point in the energy sector is also an opportunity for us to right some wrongs. And I'm not going to be the bad guy here who wants to take anything away from the municipal level. But of course, there has to be a reform. Very briefly, two things that I would like to focus on in our discussion. First, this idea of a structural reform, I think, should be debated when Christoph Müller and Klaus Müller have both an opportunity to comment. Klaus Müller mentioned that the 900 system operators are simply too many. And when it comes to distribution systems, we also have one very large one, not just all the small players. Thomas, what do you say when it comes to the operators? Can they not be merged into larger units? Well, speaking on behalf of the biggest distribution system operator in Germany, I have to be very careful what I say here. And like Mr. Müller, I will be very reluctant to name a number of system operators instead of the 900 that should be efficient. I think we should leave this to the market, and it shouldn't be dictated from the top down. As long as someone operates and is supervised by the Federal Network Agency, all individual distribution system operator or transmission system operator has the right to exist in this market. At all different levels, we are working together with the municipalities and with the city councils. This is a good, a positive way of collaborating. System operators some years ago went back to the local level. Now they come and say the risk is too high for me to bear. Things are getting more and more complex. All the innovations that are now required for the grid. Let's look at digitization, just to give one example. It's all getting too much, so can we come back together? And then in such a case, E.ON is obviously ready to cooperate. In some cases, we take over routing for the grids, we make our lines available, we offer high-quality services for smaller and medium-sized public utilities at the local level. But at the end of the day, it should be left to the market, and there shouldn't be a regulatory interference with the number of system operators. And one more thing, we have 900 system operators, and we have really made an excellent achievement last year. Massive investments, booming numbers of connections, new connections in the past 3 years. You'd be hard-pressed to find another example, and we have excellently low downtimes and individual cases of blackout. So it is really an excellent achievement, a great performance. And going back to what Robert Bush said, this structure cannot be as bad as it's sometimes made out to be. Look at what we've done. Mr. König, the only country where the supply is better is Switzerland, but they have 600 system operators. Now, before we praise ourselves too much, let's look at what the digitization report says. It was published a few weeks ago by the federal government, and it didn't say that we see a strong performance from the system operators. They said maybe 6% have already reached the required level, and the rest will still require a lot of support and are dependent on the larger players. And that's the report which I think also shows what this government is to blame for, and that is all the deficiencies in terms of digitization. And you just look at the networks, at the grids, to see what I mean. I think we will get back to this later, but a brief comment now, if you wish. Obviously, the visibility and controllability in low and medium voltage is lower than with high voltage and maximum voltage. However, I'm not criticizing that. This was simply the most efficient way of doing it, of expanding the grid at the time. Investments in digitization back then were simply not necessary, and we didn't do what was necessary. However, 10 years ago, I said already we have to make investments in digitization even down to the level of low voltage. And it's not just Germany where we are operating. I was in Warsaw in Poland last week, and we have smart meter rollout that was done in the whole city of Warsaw within 2.5 years. More meters were installed there in 2.5 years than in Germany in 10 years. In Sweden, the second generation is being done for the whole country within 3 years. So we have always argued that there shouldn't be this patchwork where you have a smart meter here and some smart device there. But we should have a whole nationwide rollout within 1 5-year period. At the end of the day, we will need smart meters in every household anyway. And it would have been much more efficient to do it all at once instead of doing a bit here and a bit there the way we're doing it now. And in Europe, we are the only country, maybe worldwide, we're the only national economy where we have such a high complexity that we have high costs and nothing that our customers benefit from. Yes, this cannot be exported, this model, and we completely agree, which doesn't happen often. Well, let's interrupt briefly at this point to welcome also Klaus Müller now, President of the Federal Network Agency. Hello, Klaus. As you can see, we are already in the middle of our debate, and we heard already the demand for a structural reform regarding grid usage fees. We heard that it might be like playing poker, where we have to make a flat rate investment to be playing at all. And we'd like to get you now into our discussion, system operators, also at the level of the large German associations are in agreement that it's good to have more consumers because that shares the cost among more players, but it's also a question of solidarity and justice of distribution. In our previous talk, you said some want more money, the others want to pay less, but it simply costs more if we expand the grids and increase the controllability of the grid. So the point all three panelists made so far is that someone has to pay the price. The operators cannot pay the price themselves. Maybe you can come in at this point, and I'm sure that there will be some contradictions here and some controversy. Absolutely, that's fine. And I would like to apologize first that I am late. I needed some more time to get where I am now, but now I am back and back online, and I'm happy to come in at this point. The cost of the grid expansion is shared by all users, and it is our task to do this as cost efficiently and as quickly as possible. And we have certain incentive systems and simplification mechanisms when it comes to grid expansion. In particular, the transmission system operators have done a lot already. And I heard the past few minutes when you discussed the smart meter rollout, I agree fully that there is a lot of room for improvement. And as Mr. König said, we have to be able to do this at lower costs. And the Federal Network Agency is fully in agreement, and we are already consulting about this. I would like to come in at this point to clarify. When it comes to digitization, I said this is not viable, but the system operator might not be the right contact partner. We need a real digitization with a flexible tariff system where you can maybe do a certain settlements only a week later. And of course, you have to be such a settlement, such invoicing systems flexible enough to generate transparency for small consumer, for small devices like heat pumps or wall boxes. And of course, if you run your washing machine overnight because the tariff is cheaper, that is not making things easier for us, but we need the respective flexibility. And if you want to go along with the energy transition, you will need a certain degree of smartness, of intelligence of the metering devices. And as we said already, we need to do this right. We shouldn't just implement something of which we're not sure whether we will need it or benefit from it or not. There are many ideas which will not be beneficial. So what we really need is the fancy new devices, the new technologies, and they have to be rolled out much quicker. And I think the distribution system operators are not the right ones to do that rollout. And they said it themselves. It's not up to them. It should be done by somebody else. Otherwise, you have to discuss the costs, the limits again. Half of the metering costs are going into the pricing system for the grid usage, so that increases grid fees again. And we really have to do this not upside down, but go about it the right way. And you have the large plant makers, you have other volumes in terms of heat pumps, etc. And then you discuss other prices and obviously other price limits. So we shouldn't lose ourselves in the details here. I think we get what you're saying. Now, Thomas, what's your answer? Well, the basic statement Mr. Bush made was that plant operators, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it should be natural for them that they provide controllability and or measurability for their devices and for their plants. At the moment, when it comes to redispatch, the limit is at 100 kilowatt, but we have a huge number of legacy plants that are not controllable at all. And here I would like a lot of transparency and clear statements from the politicians, from the Federal Network Agency, and they should make sure as soon as possible that controllability and accessibility of these technologies is given. Otherwise, there will be such a huge trust load in the grid that it will be too much for us. If you look at all the feed-in volumes we have right now during the peak times, it's obvious that we need to be able to control these volumes. Otherwise, we will have downtimes, and none of us want that. So please, as soon as possible, legacy plants, legacy connections have to be controllable and accessible.
Herr Müller, Bundesnetzagentur Müller. Wir haben ja zweimal Müller.
Das ist einfach ein toller Nachname, das muss man einfach mal so sagen.
Mr.
Das wäre ein
Müller,
Gattungsbereich.
the Müller from the Federal Network Agency. Well, isn't it a great name?
Sie rennen mit ganz vielen Punkten,
Well,
glaube ich, bei uns und jetzt immer
there are
schwierig,
many
wenn wir
points which were mentioned,
reden, aber
which
ich finde,
I
Vereinnahme
really
nehmen Sie mit,
underline.
offene Türen ein.
And
Im Sommer
I
haben
have
wir alle
no
den
problems with what you said. In summer, we saw the digitalization report, and this was quite transparent, very honest. And then in late summer, we had first analysis, and we now also published some extracts. Well, I'm sorry, I'm still hearing the airport behind me. So we now published some of the statistical values, and well, nobody is happy that some of our transparency campaign is now taken up, and we started a discussion that has taken up many of the buzzwords you were mentioning in the past 5 minutes. How can we do it faster? How can we do it low cost? How can we do it more efficient? And if we were not in an election campaign right now, I think we would have said we would have had 6 months for smart improvements. But this is history now, and this is why I would like to say that the industry, that the associations, that our agency use the next 3 months in order to agree on the facts. This might be quite fast, and then to develop ideas for the new Energy Act amendment, which has to come for the reasons that were mentioned before. We need concrete action, and yes, digitization, smart digitization, cost-efficient digitization is something that we need in the next term of office of the government. We need it in summer 2025. And yes, there is a lot of stress, technical and financial stress, but we have already made our voice heard. We very clearly said what the situation is like, and I do have some hope that after the vote of no confidence, we'll see a week of meetings in the federal parliament that we will get some decisions that were planned for this legislative period. This is giving us some hope that things will progress. Now, the other Mr. Müller, we also said that, of course, we have a lot of redispatch activities, that we cannot really optimize our consumption, and that we also have a lot of grid expansion. And then I want to talk about digitization later on, but now grid expansion and going beyond regulation, technical availability of everything that we need, well, converters and what have you. Also on the TSO side, you have major challenges in order to get the electricity from the northern part to the southern part of Germany. Is it possible in the short time available, looking at the huge tasks of Amprion, and what is the cost development here?
was man sagen muss, bei allem, was man
Well, there's one thing that you really
über die
have to
letzte
say.
Bundesregierung gerne so sagen möchte und was ich zurzeit alles lese.
With
Was
everything
wirklich
that
eine
I'm reading
positive
and hearing
Veränderung der
about the
letzten
past
Jahre war,
government,
ist, dass man
but
bei den
there were
Beschleunigungen,
some
dass man bei den
changes in the
Genehmigungsverfahren
last
wirklich
years, and this
substanzielle
is
Beschleunigungen
and we had
erreicht hat. Also wir
substantial
kommen
acceleration in
deutlich
the
schneller
approval
voran
processes. So we
beim
can make
Netzausbau. Wir sind deutlich schneller bei den
faster
Genehmigungen. Wir
progress
sind
in
auch bei
grid
konkreten
expansion. We
Bauprojekten.
get
Also da
approvals
werden wir sehen, dass
faster.
über die
Also
nächsten 3, 4
construction is
Jahre
faster.
tatsächlich
So in the
vieles
next
technisch
3
in
to 4
Betrieb geht.
years,
Und das ist kein
we'll see
PowerPoint,
a
das ist kein
lot
Konzept,
of
weil da gibt es
plants to
Leute
be
da draußen, die
started,
tatsächlich
and
schon
not only on
buddeln
PowerPoint,
und bauen
but
und
it's
machen.
real already. There are people
Also da ist viel
already
geschehen. Wir
building
bei
things in
Amprion, wir
real
nehmen uns um
life.
die
So a lot
langfristige
has happened. We
Beschaffungsstrategie.
of Amprion
Wir
want to have a
glauben, dass der Markt
long-term
tief genug ist, um
procurement
die ganzen
strategy,
Dienstleistungen
and we
bereitzustellen.
think
Aber auch
that the
da ist natürlich,
market
sehen wir
is big
schon,
enough to
gewaltigen
provide
Druck auf die Preise
services.
der
But
Dienstleister.
we
Das ist
do
auch ein
see
Thema,
a
weswegen
huge
wir uns
pressure
zusammen
on
mit den anderen
service provider
Übertragungsnetzbetreibern
prices, and this
sehr
is why
dafür
we,
einsetzen, zu
together
gucken,
with
dass man
the
die
other
Projekte
tier,
sind. Und
they
das ist
have
zurzeit
to
noch
be
ganz gut
attractive on the
gelungen.
market, and this is still very difficult.
Ja,
Thomas?
also für die nächsten 3 Jahre
For
kann
the
ich Ihnen
next
sagen,
3
haben wir
years, I can tell
langfristige
you
Lieferverträge mit allen
that
wesentlichen
we
Netzkomponenten abgesichert. Wir
are
sind
in a
da sehr
safe position
frühzeitig
because we've got
in
procurement
den Markt
contracts for
gegangen,
all the
haben
important
erstmals
components. We
für
started
die
this
wichtigsten
process
Komponenten
very
auch
early, and for the most
Take-or-Pay-Verträge
important
angeboten, um
components,
Sicherheit zu
we also
geben,
offer
weil
take
wir
or
uns,
pay
Herr Müller, aber auch etwas
contracts
liefern
in order
müssen.
to get some
Das haben wir
assurance, get some
ausreichend
safety,
versprochen.
but
Ich
also
glaube,
because we rely on
also
you,
die
Mr.
Sicherheit
Müller.
ist da.
So
Natürlich
this
brauchen wir
is
unsere Lieferanten
sure,
Zeit,
but
auch
of
jetzt
course,
Kapazitäten
our
aufzubauen. Das geht nicht von
suppliers
heute
now
auf morgen.
also need
Also
time to expand their
netztechnisch,
capacities.
Roman,
It
in den
cannot be
nächsten
done
3 Jahren
overnight.
bin ich sehr
So, from a
zuversichtlich,
technical
dass wir
point of
unsere
view, Roman, in the next
Investitionsprogramme
3 or 4 years, I'm quite
abarbeiten
confident
können. Und ich
that
will es
we
nochmal hier
can
sagen, E.ON alleine in Deutschland pro
implement
Jahr 5
our
Milliarden. Also
investment
es ist
programs, and in
mehr
Germany,
als
5 billion. This
zweieinhalbfachung
is more than
gegenüber dem
two and a
Stand
half
von vor 6,
times
7
as
Jahren.
much
Also
as we had 6 or
unsere
7 years ago.
Organisation
So our organization is really working full steam. But let me come back to one point which is giving me concerns. And here we come to cost efficiencies. As we are doing so many things at the same time, of course, prices are rising, and Mr. Müller will confirm this. We see an increase in prices for all important network or grid components massively, not 10 or 20%. Cables, transformers in different sizes, digital substations, or the civil engineering work tasks. Everything is getting more costly, and we will get less and less for a euro. We'll get less digital or physical grid. And this is what we have to discuss with the politicians and the Federal Network Agency. So what is this acceleration worth? Or do we, in view of the scarce financial means, do we have to think about postponing things? Mr. Müller, Christoph Müller, already mentioned this. Well, we have to even out the peaks, and this will reduce prices. We have to talk about it. Now, Mr. Robert Busch, when we now postpone things, this theoretically means that the functionality will come at a later point in time. Is this a topic where you say, okay, we understand this, or do you say, no, we have to be faster? I don't think we have time to postpone functionalities. The grid fees, yes, maybe, but not functionalities. The investments into renewable energies, storage, digitization, digital grids, this is necessary now. Otherwise, we have to stop energy transition, and we don't want this. We can't do this. So we have to make the investments which are necessary, and we have to take a look at what is replacement investment, what is due to the energy transition. But let me say that we can also save money in the grids by, first of all, saying what is in there. Klaus Müller talked about discounts if you don't really act to the benefit of the grid. No, this shouldn't be possible. And if Mr. König can use the grid better with his digitization, he should also be given some benefits. So digitization should also make sure that things are controlled in the correct way. And I do not have to do N-1 for each storage. You can do a lot of things, and I think underground cables should be forbidden. If you still talk about it, you haven't understood the debate. Christoph, I'm happy to come to you and go to the people on site. I'm just saying that we also have to check the costs and say, what is luxury, what is nice to have, and what is necessary. Digitization is necessary, and underground cables are luxury. Okay, perhaps we can stop the discussion now and come back to some other topics. Mr. Müller first. Robert, I think what you are saying is a little bit too easy. Yes, resources are scarce everywhere, and this is why we need prioritization. But the answer cannot be everything is important. This won't help us. This won't help us in our focus, in our priorities. In this way, we cannot really make sure that we're working on the right things. So customer change within a day, this is a topic which is very important for everybody, but this does not bring the energy transition forward in any way. So there are topics where we can find better priorities, and we have to go for priorities in order to use the resources in the right way. And then I very often hear that the underground cables are no longer possible. We do have overhead and underground cables, and I think we will not be able to only go for the overhead lines. It won't work if we tell people what to do. And this means that we have two problems. First of all, Robert, you have to listen to the companies every now and again. And I think it was Mr. Gabriel and Mr. Seehofer 8 years ago, when they took the decisions, all the TSOs, all the DSOs said that this will be much more expensive and you shouldn't go for this. But now people have taken the decision. And secondly, and I only would like to very carefully mention the press release of the TSOs on the Grid 2023. The first line in this press release is pointing out that there are 3 lines more than we deem necessary as the TSOs. This is what we said very clearly. The Federal Network Agency thought about it for a very long time, but we also are knowledgeable about it, and we have to discuss again whether these 3 lines are really necessary, because, well, it is even better not to have any line, no overhead and no earth line. Okay, brief answer, because you asked me customer changes within a day. I'm totally agree with you, but I was not talking about it. But priorities, yes, but this is not a priority. We totally agree. But that we have to prioritize digitization is something that we should also agree upon. Yes, let's come back to digitization. There were also some questions from the audience. First of all, our data protection laws don't make digitization exactly easy. And the second point, the economy of digitization, where do we find economies of scale here? If it's only taken into account in CapEx, we might have a problem. And this was also a question by the audience. Perhaps first a question to Mr. Klaus Müller. Let me say it very clearly, the driver by the 24 hours change of customer is the European Commission and the Federal Network Agency, not because we just want it for ourselves, but because this will accelerate digitization. We are having this discussion every day, and the problem is very clear, but it is a different topic. So I would like to agree to what Mr. König said, who said some minutes ago, or asked, can you rely on regulation frameworks? Yes. Yes, this is the advantage of the Federal Network Agency. We are independent and we expect the industry to take up our suggestions. We see that it will be implemented in different ways, and we are grateful for everybody who supports us. And this, of course, needs to be enabled by deregulation and financially speaking. We all know that grid expansion is increasing. It started in a very transparent manner. We use the summer and the early fall to make progress, and we are now talking to the federal states. And let me say very carefully, things are going in the right direction. It's necessary from a regulatory point of view, and now it is our goal to start a consultation mid-January, not on the basis of some milestones, but based on the information. And towards the end of 2025, we will have the law. And now the pain points, yes, they are absolutely clear. Yes, the people were not thrilled by the 3-year period that we deem necessary. Then we'll also have to talk about the OPEX costs. We want to see the OPEX costs, and if we see these costs, the Federal Network Agency can also imagine to respond more quickly than in the textbook. And in some areas we already did. This is absolutely on the table, but we want to see OPEX. And this is also my answer to you, Mr. Dudenhausen, CapEx or OPEX. Yes, we have to show the costs for the energy transition, and this is undenied. And now it's only a few weeks, and mid of January we'll have the next consultations, final round, second half of our discussion. discussions. And we, of course, also take a look at the TSOs. This is, on the one hand, easier, on the one hand, more complex. So there are fewer colleagues involved, but still the challenges are very ambitious. And I now am traveling to London to an international financial conference in order to say that Germany is a great place to invest, and that we then roll out everything that we have in terms of simplification and reduction of complexities.
Thomas, I think it's up to you now to respond. Well, several things come together here. First, responding to what Mr. Bush said, that was really a firework of arguments regarding digitization. I absolutely agree that digitization is a top priority, and we have 2 regions in Germany already where we installed and equipped everything to the latest state of the art, and that is what we want to make use of before we make further progress in other areas. That's what we should be doing first. And then let me bring 2 different arguments together. You mentioned the reenactment of the Energy Industry Act in Germany. I think there will be some improvements. Thank you very much, Mr. Müller, for being such a strong champion of this reform. But if you go to the controllability of 2 kilowatts, that is a hairdryer. That is a waste of resources. It doesn't help us at all with becoming more flexible, and it's simply not the right approach. A misallocation of resources would be the consequence. And speaking of digitization, we need these resources for other purposes. So before we go down to this level of 2 kilowatts, let's look at all the legacy installed capacities with a much higher potential, much higher volumes that are not yet accessible and controllable before we go down to private households and hairdryers. And then, Mr. Müller, I'm really curious to find out what they will tell you in London. This is not the first conference you are traveling to. And the conference that recently took place with the Reconstruction Loan Corporation, the KfW, showed some very clear signals from investors that the yield was far too low if you compare it at the international level. And we see that financial means are not coming to Germany. They go into other countries with similar potential. And the other Mr. Müller in the round here has also mentioned it already, and maybe we can come back to it later. The financing of the energy transition is, from my viewpoint, currently really endangered. And if you don't take this seriously, you neglect something that is very important. We are investing billions. We are having talks with investors, equity investors, as much as banks. And let me tell you, it is getting more difficult. And I also know of smaller companies that they have a large number of projects which they do no longer get financing for. And we cannot simply leave this aside. We have to discuss investment-friendly parameters in Germany for the needed grid expansion in Germany. So maybe let's discuss controllability first and then financing second. Klaus Müller, would you like to comment on controllability of a hairdryer? Of course, Thomas Koenig, that's very polemic, but these remarks, of course, you are entitled to them. We believe that we need the controllability at that level. Of course, we can discuss the scheduling. We have discussed an escalation of these models. And of course, it's to be hand in hand with grid expansion, but I also want this to be legally pinpointed. And we will no longer discuss this because it has been concluded, but there will be a strict definition within the fourth version of the German Energy Industry Act. That is, of course, all on the agenda of the next federal government in Germany. And then, of course, there is also the question of peak times for solar energy. We have to keep in mind the solidarity with our neighboring countries. And these are really my favorite topics that should be top of our agenda. And now I'm happy to talk financing. Well, maybe Christoph Müller can also provide his viewpoint on behalf of a TSO in comparison with what Thomas König said. Well, we see that it's really difficult to mobilize equity. That is not so much a problem, or the contrary. We get leverage. We can see that there is a lot of trust in Germany and in the business model of a TSO and the Federal Network Agency. But of course, when people have the choice between equity and leverage is so much easier, they go for leverage. However, we should be able to mobilize more equity, but it's really, really difficult. And it's difficult for TSOs to be converted into new ownership structures. This is classified as one of the least flexible in the whole of Europe. This system in the UK, for instance, you can see structures which are much more flexible, and the UK also offers an attractive economy. So financing through equity with the current return on equity that we can offer is not doable. And Robert Bush also said that he fully understands the need for strong financing for the grids. So, Mr. Müller, what do we do? I simply think that this is not correct. I fully agree with Thomas König. Everybody is taking this problem seriously. And I think that's important. When Jochen Roman, when I succeeded him as a president, we were both aware of the fact that it was difficult to provide financing with equity. That was a thing of the past, and it's a thing of the present. And Mr. König and myself and everyone in the industry should remind us. We also read the reports published by the rating agencies. I'm at Heathrow Airport at the moment. That's the noises you hear from the background here. And the surcharge on the cost of capital was one first aid measure, and I still believe firmly that this was the right thing to do. I had to justify this often vis-à-vis the chemical industry, the mechanical engineers, consumer protectors, etc. They were not in favor of this first aid measure, and we triggered then the next process. We always said we want to simplify things, and of course we also discuss interest rates. No doubt about that. I want to remind that Ms. Lagarde has made our life easier 3 times already. Let's not forget that. We don't have the interest rate level that we had at the beginning of the current year, but I repeat myself, we want an attractive environment, but every step the Federal Network Agency makes takes us to a debate about too high grid usage fees. And my colleagues, Mr. König, Mr. Müller, of course, pointed out that the grid usage fees are made up of different parts, but there is not just the one part that we can control. We have different controllable parameters that we do control. The next one would be grants for construction costs. Let's wait the next 24 hours, and then there will be a position paper on a new mechanism, which not everybody will be happy about either, because this will change reality. And that's what it's supposed to do, offering financial incentives. And at the beginning of the year, we always said the first quarter, there should be a new interest rate, and that's of course all about the yield of equity. The question of a capital market adequate interest rate or yield has nothing to do with grid usage fees. I understand there is a political association, but if you look at this very matter-of-factly, what is adequate for the capital market in terms of yield, the grid fees don't play a role. Of course, but if we do this only in a purely mathematical way, not everybody will be happy, because then we'll have to go back to historical interest rates and yield curves. And looking at the increasing demand for financing, I think this will not make everyone happy, and that's why the Federal Network Agency is using the controls, the different parameters that we can control in order to regulate this. And of course, it's always a technical question. There will always be players in the field who are not happy, who will say it's too much or it's too little. But we are not doing any collective bargaining here, and we're also not throwing dice. We are doing this on the basis of facts. We have to do this in view of the ramp up that is going to happen, that is happening already, and that's what has to be part of our awareness on this panel. There are different interests, different stakeholders, which all have to be taken into account, and we will do that. But we need the simplification first. The structure has to be firm and improved, and then we can discuss yields, which I think will be embedded with a mechanism which is part of the solution. But of course, in the end of the day, it's also going to be about the money. Well, two more sentences. I'm not the BDI or other association who represents those who pay the grid usage fees, and things have also changed. In the past, it was different when the associations brought in their experts in order to fight for lower grid fees. Always a bit surprised that this is not happening anymore. Maybe we should go for some kind of new movement. Klaus Müller will know it, that it's usually us and not so many other representatives who fight. And it seems a bit unjust sometimes, but let's forget about all that. Of course, we don't want prices to skyrocket, but of course, the grids need to be performant, as much as needed, as little as possible. I think we all agree on that. The municipalities don't have funds at the moment. We all know that as well. And we don't have a nationwide business model that is viable because of this lack of a functioning financing mechanism. It's really sometimes just a situation where you don't have enough for anything, but it is still too much to just give up and leave it all at that. Well, Mr. König, we are operating our networks and our systems in an economical fashion. I don't know what others are doing. I'm not going to comment on that, but let me tie on to one thing that Christoph Müller said. One thing, one cost item to be settled against another one is sometimes just not practical. And earlier we had a series of really interesting approaches regarding cost reduction and cost compensation, also addressing the system operators. And I'm happy to accept the challenge. Fine. It's absolutely fine, but you are representing an industry where I really wonder if today you make an investment in a secure bottleneck and still get a high premium payment afterwards that is shared by less and less system operators. That is really a lever that we should tackle, because the largest cost driver over the past years is not the cost of capital for higher investments, it's the cost that is incurred because the grid expansion is not happening, and the expansion in regions that are already overloaded for renewable energies have increased the redispatch costs to where they are now. And Mr. Müller said it as well, and I would like to emphasize it again. We pay more for redispatch than all system operators, including distribution network operators, for their use of equity. And redispatch, the cost of redispatch, to put this into perspective, for 4.5 billion euros, with absolutely no benefit for the energy transition. That is a whole mix of different funds and budgets we have to dip into, but we have to focus on the right items, not redispatch, and then really punishing people with a low yield on their equity.
Let's ask the other three very briefly before we then have the final question. Yes, you are right. We need better control of local connections, but then you are in the model of electricity price zones. So if you want to have a capacity market, you need a signal where to build power plants, and then you want to have them all in the north. So you need some signal that they should go to the south. But if it's not about price zones, how can you do this? Then you need construction payment subsidies. But Mr. Müller has a solution. The federal government has done a lot. Grid expansion is increasing, and this reduces redispatch costs. So many things are happening, and we can transport things now into the south. I'm not sure what E.ON says on the prices. Probably you are against it, but well, we'll have to wait and see. Well, Mr. Müller is already shaking his head. Luckily, we are not for different price zones for various reasons. I think we are agreeing on this. Mr. Müller will also talk about it. But you already mentioned construction subsidies. Yes, those who do a grid expansion should also get subsidies for construction and redispatch. Well, if we now invest into bottlenecks, they shouldn't receive any compensation any longer. Now, Christoph Müller and then Klaus Müller, please.
Robert, du hast das Preissignal angesprochen.
Robert, you mentioned the price signal or the allocation signal. Well,
Herr König hat es gesagt. Ja,
Mr. König has already mentioned it.
Also 4 Milliarden Glocken, die da nächstes
4
Jahr läuten werden. Ja,
billion of bells which will be
wir
ringing
haben
next
ein
year.
Preissignal, wir haben ein
We do have a
Allokationssignal.
price signal, we
Und
do have
die
an
Engpässe
allocation
im Netz sind ja
signal,
nicht weg,
and
wenn
the
wir das mit zwei
bottlenecks in the
Preissignalen.
grid
Also
are
das ist nicht mal
not
so süß,
gone
dass man
if you
sagt,
have
ja, wir
two
machen
price
zwei Preiszonen,
zones.
das Problem
It
ist weg. Nee,
sounds
das
so
ist nicht.
easy.
Und
Well,
wir
we do
kennen das
have
Problem und es
two
wird uns
price
auch beim
zones and the problem will be
Allokationssignal
gone. No,
klar
we know
angezeigt.
the
Und wenn wir
problem
jetzt
and
eine
we already see it in the
Preiszonendebatte
allocation
starten
as
oder
well.
auch eine
And if you
Umsetzung,
now
kostet das
start a
mindestens
price zone
fünf
debate, it
Jahre, wo
will
wir dann
cost us
wieder
at
andere
least
Sachen
5 years,
runterpriorisieren, wie zum Beispiel
where we
Smart Meter
have to
Rollout.
lower the
Und am
priorities
Ende
for
stellen
other
wir dann
things, for
fest, dass
example,
mit dem
smart
ganzen Netzausbau, der
meter
in den nächsten Jahren
rollout.
kommt, das
And then
Problem gar nicht mehr so
finally,
groß ist.
we will
Also
see later on
theoretisch
that the
sind
problem is not that big.
Preiszonen ein wunderbares Konzept.
Theoretically, price zones
Praktisch
are a
würde ich sagen,
wonderful
kümmern wir uns
concept,
die Themen,
but
da
from
bin
a
ich wieder beim
practical
Thema
point of
Priorisierung,
view,
die wirklich
let's
wichtig
deal
sind.
with the
Und das
real
ist zum Beispiel
topics,
der
the
Smart Meter
burning
Rollout.
topics,
Es
and
sind
this
dann
is
auch
smart meter rollout.
Lebensweise ein
And this
Allokationssignal, also
also means
Baukostenzuschusse auch auf der
allocation
Einspeiserseite.
signals such
Ja,
as construction
das ist nicht
subsidies
gesetzlich
also on
verboten
the
an der Stelle oder
feed-in
gesetzlich
side.
untersagt, aber ich
It's
glaube, auch
now
darüber muss man
legally
reden.
forbidden, but I think
Das
we
sind
should
Sachen, die uns
discuss
sehr
this topic
schnell, sehr
again.
konkret nach vorne
So
bringen.
these are things
Und
that
eine
would
Preiszonendebatte
make us
aufspalten, all
progress
das
quite quickly.
macht an der
And a
Stelle
discussion about
frisst
price
nur Zeit,
zones
frisst nur
or anything
Umsetzungskraft
else will
und
only
nebenbei
cost time,
entfernt
will
uns auch
cost
von dem
money, will cost
Solidaritätsgedanken,
energy, and
den ich
will
bei der
lead us
Umsetzung der
away
deutschen
from the
Energiewirtschaft
idea of
eigentlich immer noch
solidarity
spüre.
that I
Und ich
still
glaube,
feel
wenn
in
dann
the
tatsächlich die
implementation of the
süddeutsche
German
Hälfte sich mal
energy
überlegt,
industry. And
wo
if the
zahlen wir denn
southern
eigentlich die
German
Solidarität ein,
half thinks
und das dann
about
auch mal in
where
Frage
are
stellen,
we
dann kommen wir in Debatten
paying
rein, die wir alle nicht
and
wollen. Also
question this, then
wir
we
setzen uns dafür ein,
will
die Einheitspreiszone zu
have to
erhalten.
face debates
Aus
that we
politischen
all
Gründen, aus aus
don't
operativen
want.
Gründen und aus
For
Energiegründen.
political and operational and energy reasons, we have to stick with what we have right now. Klaus Müller. Well, now I can tick off many things. Everything that was said by Mr. Müller is absolutely right, especially his last statement. Of course, we also want to progress the energy transition in a very honest manner. And then construction subsidies, yes, now we have seen where people are worried and we have to have some transition time, but we will first have a position paper and then we will have to collect views. And I would be grateful if the industry in all its facets will send the right localization, allocation or price signals if there is an agreement that we need this. And let me also underline, both for those who buy electricity and those who feed in electricity, we have to make sure that they all understand that renewables are also important and construction subsidies are a good and reasonable instrument here. Well, let me first of all thank you very much for the discussion. It was quite exciting and it was a heated debate, more so than I expected. And let's hope now that after the vote of confidence, we can at least handle some of the topics. Well, what has become very clear now is that there are still a lot of things that we have to agree upon, not only on interest rates or returns. We already said that in the next phase, we'll have to talk about the equity rates. And then digitization as well is very important. And this is shocking sometimes if you talk to your friends and see how much money is wasted because digitization is not optimized. And Christoph Müller and Klaus Müller have mentioned some figures. These are billions which are lost. And in today's time where money is scarce, this is a big challenge and all of us have to tackle this topic together. So let me thank you very much for the discussion, and I would be happy to meet you at eWorld in February to continue this discussion. And now I wish you a successful day, and to Klaus Müller, a lot of success in finding money for the energy transition. Yes, I also would like to thank you very much for this very heated debate at some points.
Also,
It's
wollte
not
sagen,
really
hitzig ist
heated.
anders.
Heated would still be different.
Das war
Okay,
engagiert.
Engagiert.
positive and committed discussion.
Wunderbar. Vielen Dank für die Einschätzung
Thank
dann
you
auch nochmal von Ihrer
very
Seite,
much
die
for
Sie
your
sehr teilgenommen
insights.
haben. Roman, vielleicht als Abschlussfrage. Wir haben ja
Roman,
mehrmals
perhaps
über
as a
die Frage
final
geschrieben,
question.
hält das Netz die
The
Energiewende aus? Und jetzt
topic
haben
of the
wir
discussion was,
viele
can the grid bear the energy
Stichworte genannt
transition?
und
And
es
now
wurde
a lot of
vieles
buzzwords were mentioned and the
angesprochen.
discussion
Tief
talked about
eingestiegen,
many
auch
details. We had a deep
beurteilen kann.
dive on
Was
many
meinst du? Hält das Netz die
areas. What
Energiewende
is
aus?
your summary? Will the grid bear the energy transition? Well, we have started, everybody is going in the right direction, and optimistically speaking, if everybody is working on this with a great deal of optimism, we will do this. And you already said that we pointed out to eWorld, and this will be just before the general elections if everything goes as planned. And I'm curious to see what the situation will be then and how the discussions will go on. Thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to the next e-world. But first, I look forward to tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll probably come back to some of the points we discussed today, and we will discuss about the energy security of supply in Germany and in Europe. Financing was a major issue today, and we will take another look at this topic on Thursday with a focus on the heat transition. I would be happy to see you there as well. And finally, I also would like to thank the 4 panelists today. It was great to have you here. Roman, thank you very much for hosting this panel discussion. And a big thank you to everybody who made this event possible behind the scenes. These was the technical team and also our 2 interpreters. We are looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 9:30 and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.